Mosquito boats. A night attack off Vela La Vela. The night before. July 19th, 1943. Rendova Harbor, Solomon Islands. The air hangs thick and wet against my skin, so heavy it feels like breathing through a wet towel. I'm 22 years old, a motor machinist's mate first class aboard PT-164, and I'm checking the starboard Packard engine for the third time tonight because my hands need something to do besides shake. The engine compartment reeks of high-octane gasoline, hot metal, and the sweet rot of jungle vegetation that clings to everything in these godforsaken islands. Above me, through the open hatch, I can see stars scattered across the equatorial sky like diamond chips on black velvet, so bright and indifferent they might be mocking us. Around the cramped anchorage at Lumbari, 16 PT boats bob gently in the dark water, their hulls barely visible as darker shadows against the black. No lights showing, not a single cigarette glow. The Japanese own the night here, and they own the air during the day, which means we operate in the thin margins between darkness and dawn, between visibility and blindness, between life and the sudden violence of high-explosive shells tearing through 3/4-inch plywood hulls. My boat, 164, is one of the newer Elco 80-footers, though newer is relative when every boat in the squadron looks like it's been through a meat grinder. Our gray paint is blistered and peeling from salt spray and tropical sun. The forward deck shows scorch marks from a strafing run 2 weeks ago that killed our original bow gunner, a kid from Nebraska named Thompson, who'd been talking about his girlfriend's letters right before the Zero came in low over the tree line. We haven't repainted, haven't had time, haven't had paint. The briefing came down 3 hours ago. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Warfield, our squadron commander, gathered the boat captains in a tent that serves as our operations center, such as it is. The rest of us, the enlisted men who actually run these boats, who nurse their temperamental engines and load their torpedoes and man their guns, we got our orders filtered down through our skippers. But I know what's coming. We all do. You can feel it in the way the chiefs move, the way they check and recheck equipment, the way they don't quite meet your eyes when they tell you to fuel up to maximum capacity. We're going north tonight, way north, up through Blackett Strait and into the waters off Vela La Vela, deep into what we call the slot, that stretch of water between the parallel chains of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese call it the slot too, I heard, but they have another name for it that translates roughly to the road. It's their highway, their supply route, the only way they can move troops and equipment between their major bases without exposing themselves to American air power during daylight hours. Every night, Japanese destroyers and cruisers race down from Rabaul, moving so fast and so predictably that our guys have nicknamed the operation the Tokyo Express. Some of the more cynical sailors call it the Rat Run, watching those sleek, powerful warships sprint through darkness to reinforce their garrisons on Kolombangara and Vila. Tonight, we're going to intercept them. My skipper, Lieutenant John Jack Searles, is 26 years old and looks 40 in the dim light filtering down from the stars. He's a good officer, the kind who knows that PT boats don't win through firepower or armor, we have neither, but through speed, darkness, and the controlled desperation of men who understand they're piloting essentially weaponized speedboats against ships that could obliterate us with a single salvo. He joined me at the engine compartment an hour ago, stood there silently while I torqued down the last valve cover, then simply said, "We're going to make them pay tonight, Donovan." I'm not sure who "they" is in that sentence. The Japanese? Fate? The goddamn Solomon Islands themselves? But I nodded because that's what you do. Our crew is 12 men in 80 feet of plywood, aluminum, and mahogany, powered by 3 1,500-horsepower Packard engines that can push us to 40 knots on calm water, though the seas are never calm and the engines are never at full health. We carry 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, 2,000 pounds of high explosive that might or might not run true, might or might not detonate if they hit, might or might not blow us all to pieces if a Japanese shell finds them in their tubes. We have twin 50-caliber machine guns on the turret forward, 2 more on the stern, and a 20mm Ehrlichen cannon amidships that jams approximately every 50 rounds in the humid air. The other boats in our division, PT-159, PT-157, and PT-171, are making their own preparations. I can hear the low rumble of engines being tested, the metallic clank of ammunition being loaded, the quiet voices of men who are trying not to think too hard about what we're about to do. Some of them are writing letters that'll leave with the base personnel just in case. Some are praying. Some, like our bow gunner replacement, a tough kid from Boston named Murphy, who volunteered for the position despite knowing what happened to Thompson, are cleaning their weapons with the focus of men performing a religious ritual. The jungle behind our anchorage is alive with sound. Tree frogs shriek in rhythmic pulses. Insects drone in clouds so thick they sound like distant aircraft. Somewhere in the darkness, a nightbird calls with a sound like tearing metal. The jungle here isn't a backdrop, it's an active participant in the war, rotting our equipment, harboring diseases that kill as efficiently as Japanese bullets, hiding enemy soldiers who materialize from the green shadows to kill sentries and disappear before anyone can respond. Guadalupe taught us that. The jungle is another enemy, patient and implacable. Ensign Robert Miller appears at the edge of the dock. He's 21, fresh from officer candidate school, and this will be his 3rd combat patrol. His first ended when a Japanese float plane dropped a bomb that missed us by 20 feet, but close enough that the concussion threw 2 men overboard and ruptured one of our fuel tanks. His second patrol was uneventful, which felt almost worse, because we motored through darkness for 8 hours, nerves screaming, only to return without firing a shot. Tonight will be different. The intelligence reports are solid. The Tokyo Express is running, and we know their route. "Donovan," Miller calls down softly. "Skipper wants all hands topside in 5 minutes." I close the engine hatch and climb onto the deck, my hands black with grease, my dungarees soaked through with sweat despite the relatively cool evening air. The rest of the crew assembles in the cramped space between the torpedo tubes and the day room hatch. We're a cross-section of America in miniature. Miller from Connecticut, Searles from Oregon, Murphy from South Boston, our radio man Jenkins from Alabama, our radar operator Kowalski from Chicago, our quartermaster Hayes from Texas, our torpedo man Peterson from Minnesota. We forged together by proximity, danger, and the particular intensity that comes from operating tiny, fragile boats in waters controlled by an enemy that would love nothing more than to catch us in their searchlights. Lieutenant Searles faces us, his features barely visible in the starlight. When he speaks, his voice is calm, almost casual, as if we're discussing tomorrow's duty roster instead of a mission that might kill us all.
"Gentlemen, here's the situation. Naval intelligence confirms the Tokyo Express will be running tonight, probably 4 destroyers headed south to Vila. They're expected to transit the waters off Vela La Vela between 0100 and 0200 hours. We'll be positioned with 3 other boats to intercept. Our job is simple. Get torpedoes into those destroyers, disrupt their supply run, and get home alive." He pauses, letting that sink in. Simple. Nothing about this is simple. The moon sets at 23:45 hours. We'll have perhaps 90 minutes of complete darkness to work with. After that, false dawn starts and we lose our advantage. Speed is essential. Surprise is essential. If they get their searchlights on us before we launch torpedoes, we break contact immediately and run. These are Fubuki-class destroyers, possibly Kagero-class. They can do 35 knots, they carry 5-inch guns that will tear us apart, and they have experienced crews who've been running this route for months. We are not engaging in a gun duel with a destroyer. Is that clear? We all nod. We've seen what happens when PT boats try to slug it out with surface combatants. It ends badly. Our weapons are torpedoes and darkness, and if we lose either advantage, we die. Murphy, Searles continues, looking at our new bow gunner, your job is open fire on my direct order. Your job is to suppress their bridge if we're lit up. Give us seconds to break away. You're not trying to sink a destroyer with .5 caliber rounds, you're trying to make them duck. Understood, sir, Murphy says, his Boston accent thick even in those two words. Peterson, the torpedoes are set for 8-foot depth, speed set for 46 knots, straight running. We're going to get close, very close, because these Mark 8s are about as reliable as a $3 watch. I want to be inside 600 yards before we shoot, preferably 400 yards. 400 yards, close enough to see the faces of Japanese sailors on the destroyer's deck, close enough that if our torpedoes fail to launch properly, if they porpoise or run deep or simply refuse to leave their tubes, the destroyer's guns will obliterate us before we can escape. But Peterson just nods because he knows, we all know, that the Mark 8 torpedo is a temperamental weapon, prone to running deeper than set, prone to failing to detonate even when it hits, prone to every mechanical failure that can doom a precision weapon built in peacetime and asked to perform in wartime conditions. Searles continues, we're departing in 30 minutes. Radio silence once we clear Ferguson Passage. Radar only if absolutely necessary. We're going in dark, quiet, and fast. The other boats will be on parallel courses. If we encounter the Express, each boat picks its target independently. No coordination beyond hand signals and recognition lights. Understood. Another round of nods. This isn't our first night patrol, though it will be our deepest penetration into Japanese-controlled waters. The Solomon Islands campaign has been grinding forward since Guadalcanal was taken last February. 8 months of brutal fighting on land and sea. The Marines are pushing north through the islands. The Navy is trying to choke off Japanese reinforcement. And we, the PT boats, the Mosquito fleet, we're the ones operating in the gaps, in the darkness, in the narrow channels where big ships can't go and where destroyers think they own the night. One more thing, Searles adds, and his voice drops lower. If we're hit and the boat's going down, you get over the side immediately. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to save equipment. The Japanese don't stop to pick up survivors, and neither do we if we're under fire. You get in the water, you swim away from the boat in case she explodes, and you wait for dawn when the Catalinas can search. We'll come back for you if we can, but your first priority is getting off a dying boat. The silence that follows that instruction is heavy. We've all heard stories. PT-44 took a direct hit from a Japanese cruiser off Guadalcanal in January, blew apart in a fireball that could be seen from 10 miles away. No survivors. PT-37 ran aground during a night action, couldn't get free, was strafed and bombed at first light. 3 men made it to shore. The jungle got 2 of them. Or maybe it's that every man here is imagining himself in dark water, alone, wounded, watching his boat burning or sinking, wondering if the rescue will come before exposure and sharks finish the job. The waters around the Solomons are thick with sharks, big ones, drawn by the blood and debris of naval battles that have churned these seas into a marine graveyard. Questions? Searles asks. There are always questions, but none we ask aloud. Will the torpedoes work? Will our engines hold together at high speed? Will the Japanese radar detect us before we detect them? Will we be fast enough, lucky enough, skilled enough to survive contact with warships that outgun us by orders of magnitude? But these aren't questions that have answers, so we stay silent. Good. Check your gear, check your buddy's gear. 30 minutes. The briefing breaks up. Men scatter to their stations, each with his own ritual, his own way of preparing for what's coming. I return to the engine compartment one more time, not because the engines need checking, but because I need to be doing something with my hands, need to be in the familiar mechanical spaces where problems have solutions and everything makes sense. The Packard engines are miracles of American engineering, V-12 aircraft engines adapted for marine use, each one capable of 1,500 horsepower when they're running right. They're also maintenance nightmares in the tropical environment, prone to overheating, to spark plug fouling, to oil leaks and coolant issues. I've spent more time with these engines than I have with any human being since enlisting. I know their sounds, their vibrations, the subtle changes in pitch that mean something's wrong before the temperature gauges confirm it. Tonight, they need to be perfect. I run my hands over the cooling lines one more time, checking for weak spots, for anything that might fail under sustained high-speed operation. The port engine has been running slightly rough, a misfire in one cylinder that I've been chasing for 3 days. I've changed plugs, adjusted timing, checked compression. It's better now, but not perfect. It'll have to do. Topside, I can hear the crew making final preparations. The metallic click of ammunition being loaded into the 50 caliber guns, the heavier clunk of 20mm shells going into the Oerlikons magazine. Each sound is familiar, part of the symphony of preparation that turns a plywood piece of boat into a weapon of war. Jenkins, our radio man, is in the tiny radio shack checking frequencies, ensuring that if we need to call for help or report contact, the equipment will function. Radio silence is the rule on these patrols, but the radios have to work because the moment we engage, silence becomes irrelevant. The entire Japanese garrison on Kolombingara will know we're there the instant torpedoes hit water. Hayes, our quartermaster, is laying out charts on the small navigation table, plotting our course through the maze of islands, reefs, and shoals that make these waters treacherous even in daylight. At night, without running lights, navigation becomes an exercise in memory, skill, and hope. We've run Ferguson Passage a dozen times, know its currents and rocks, but once we enter Blackett Strait and head north towards Vela Lavella, we're in less familiar waters. Waters the Japanese know intimately because they control them. One more thing, Searles adds, and his voice drops lower. If we're hit and the boat's going down, you get over the side immediately. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to save equipment. The Japanese don't stop to pick up survivors, and neither do we if we're under fire. You get in the water, you swim away from the boat in case she explodes, and you wait for dawn when the Catalinas can search. We'll come back for you if we can, but your first priority is getting off a dying boat. The silence that follows that instruction is heavy. We've all heard stories. PT-44 took a direct hit from a Japanese cruiser off Guadalcanal in January, blew apart in a fireball that could be seen from 10 miles away. No survivors. PT-37 ran aground during a night action, couldn't get free, was strafed and bombed at first light. 3 men made it to shore. The jungle got 2 of them. Or maybe it's that every man here is imagining himself in dark water, alone, wounded, watching his boat burning or sinking, wondering if the rescue will come before exposure and sharks finish the job. The waters around the Solomons are thick with sharks, big ones, drawn by the blood and debris of naval battles that have churned these seas into a marine graveyard. Questions? Searles asks. There are always questions, but none we ask aloud. Will the torpedoes work? Will our engines hold together at high speed? Will the Japanese radar detect us before we detect them? Will we be fast enough, lucky enough, skilled enough to survive contact with warships that outgun us by orders of magnitude? But these aren't questions that have answers, so we stay silent. Good. Check your gear, check your buddy's gear. 30 minutes. The briefing breaks up. Men scatter to their stations, each with his own ritual, his own way of preparing for what's coming. I return to the engine compartment one more time, not because the engines need checking, but because I need to be doing something with my hands. Need to be in the familiar mechanical spaces where problems have solutions and everything makes sense. The Packard engines are miracles of American engineering. V-12 aircraft engines adapted for marine use, each one capable of 1,500 horsepower when they're running right. They're also maintenance nightmares in the tropical environment, prone to overheating, to spark plug fouling, to oil leaks and coolant issues. I've spent more time with these engines than I have with any human being since enlisting. I know their sounds, their vibrations,
The subtle changes in pitch that mean something's wrong before the temperature gauges confirm it. Tonight, they need to be perfect. I run my hands over the cooling lines one more time, checking for weak spots, for anything that might fail under sustained high-speed operation. The port engine has been running slightly rough, a misfire in one cylinder that I've been chasing for 3 days.
I've changed plugs, adjusted timing, checked compression. It's better now, but not perfect. It'll have to do. Topside, I can hear the crew making final preparations. The metallic click of ammunition being loaded into the 50 caliber guns. The heavier clunk of 20mm shells going into the Oerlikon's magazine. The sound of Peterson and his torpedo men removing the safety mechanisms from the Mark 8s, arming them for launch. Each sound is familiar, part of the symphony of preparation that turns a floating piece of plywood into a weapon of war. Jenkins, our radio man, is in the tiny radio shack checking frequencies, ensuring that if we need to call for help or report contact, the equipment will function. Radio silence is the rule on these patrols, but the radios have to work because the moment we engage, silence becomes irrelevant. The entire Japanese garrison on Kolombangara will know we're there the instant torpedoes hit water. Hayes, our quartermaster, is laying out charts on the small navigation table, plotting our course through the maze of islands, reefs, and shoals that make these waters treacherous even in daylight. At night, without running lights, navigation becomes an exercise in memory, skill, and hope. We've run Ferguson Passage a dozen times, know its currents and rocks. But once we enter Blackett Strait and head north toward Vela, we're in less familiar waters. Waters the Japanese know intimately because they control them. I climb back topside and stand for a moment at the stern, looking out over Rendova Harbor. Other PT boats are dark shapes against darker water. On the shore, hidden under camouflage netting and jungle canopy, is our base. Quonset huts, fuel dumps, torpedo workshops, the rudimentary facilities that support this insane operation of sending plywood boats against the Imperial Japanese Navy. It's not much, but it's become home over the past 2 months. If we don't come back, this view will be the last memory of land. Murphy joins me at the stern rail. He's young, maybe 20, with the wiry build of a street fighter and the nervous energy of a man who knows he's taken a dead man's position. First time going north? I ask him. Yeah, he says, not taking his eyes off the dark water. You? Third. First 2 times we didn't make contact, just motored around in the dark for hours, then came home. Think tonight's different? I consider lying, offering reassurance, but Murphy deserves better. Yeah, intelligence is solid this time. They're coming. He nods slowly. Good. I didn't volunteer for this to sightsee. That's the thing about PT boat crews. We're all volunteers, every one of us. The Navy doesn't assign men to these boats because the casualty rates would make it cruel. You have to volunteer, have to actively choose to crew a vessel that has a life expectancy measured in weeks once committed to combat operations. Some men volunteer for the adventure, for the glory, for the chance to be in a small crew where you matter as an individual instead of an anonymous cog in a battleship or cruiser. Some volunteer because they're young and stupid and think they're immortal. Some volunteer because they want to fight, really fight, want to be close enough to see the enemy's face when you kill him. I volunteered because I'm good with engines, and because after Pearl Harbor, I wanted to be part of something that mattered, something that would hurt the Japanese for what they'd done. That motivation seems simultaneously valid and naive now, standing on the deck of PT-164 in the humid darkness, waiting to motor into harm's way. All right, listen up. Lieutenant Searles' voice cuts through the quiet. We're moving. Man your stations. Donovan, give me engines. I drop down into the engine compartment and the world contracts to the mechanical reality of 3 massive V-12s. I hit the starters in sequence. Port, center, starboard. The Packards cough, rumble, catch, settle into a deep, powerful idle that I can feel through my bones. Oil pressure good. Coolant temperature rising normally. RPM steady. I flip the intercom switch. Engine room reports all 3 engines running, all systems nominal, sir. Very good. Stand by for maneuvering. Through the hull, I can feel the boat coming alive as other systems activate. The rudders move as Hayes tests steering. The radar mast rotates as Kowalski brings the primitive air search system online. Murphy's 50 caliber guns traverse in their turret, the mechanisms well-oiled and smooth. We cast off from the dock with minimal sound, just the quiet splash of mooring lines hitting water and the low rumble of idling engines. PT-159 is ahead of us, PT-157 behind, all three boats moving in a loose column toward the mouth of the harbor. Somewhere in the darkness, PT-171 is taking a parallel course. 4 boats, 4 chances to hurt the Tokyo Express. 4 fragile vessels against the combined might of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
As we clear the harbor and enter Ferguson Passage, Lieutenant Searles advances the throttles. The Packards respond with a rising howl, and PT-164 lifts her bow as we accelerate toward 30 knots. The plywood hull begins to vibrate, that characteristic high-frequency shudder that means we're skimming rather than plowing through the water. Behind us, Rendova disappears into the darkness, and ahead lies the vast blackness of the Solomon Sea and whatever is coming down the slot tonight. I stand in the engine compartment, one hand on the center engine's cowling, feeling its heat and power, and I think about what Lieutenant Searles said. We are going to make them pay tonight. For the sailors who died at Pearl Harbor, for the Marines bleeding on Guadalcanal, for Thompson, our bow gunner, who died 2 weeks ago with his girlfriend's name on his lips, for all of us who've been stuck in these miserable islands, fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that refuses to surrender, refuses to give up, refuses to acknowledge that they're losing. Tonight, we're going to make them pay. And maybe, if we're very skilled and very lucky, we'll live to see tomorrow's sunrise. The Mosquito Boats, Genesis and Design. To understand why 12 men in a plywood boat think they can attack Japanese destroyers, you have to understand what a PT boat actually is, where it came from, and why the U.S. Navy was desperate enough to build hundreds of them, despite their obvious limitations. The story starts not in the Pacific, but in the Atlantic, and not during World War II, but in the years leading up to it, when some forward-thinking naval officers realized that future wars might need weapons that didn't exist yet. The PT boat, PT standing for Patrol Torpedo, though we called them a dozen other names, most of them unprintable, was born from an idea that seemed insane to battleship admirals, that a small, fast, cheap vessel could sink a large, slow, expensive one using torpedoes and the cover of darkness. The British had experimented with motor torpedo boats during World War I, small craft that could theoretically sneak into harbors and attack anchored warships. The Italians refined the concept in the 1920s and 30s, building fast motorboats armed with torpedoes that were intended for Mediterranean operations. The Germans took note, developing their own Schnellboots, S-boats, which Allied sailors would later call E-boats in European waters, fast attack craft that could hit 40 knots and carried torpedoes that actually worked. The United States Navy, meanwhile, was institutionally obsessed with battleships and aircraft carriers, with the big gun surface fleet that had dominated naval thinking since Admiral Maynhan wrote his theories on sea power. But a few mavericks in the Navy Department saw the writing on the wall. They looked at the vast Pacific Ocean, at thousands of islands where big ships couldn't operate effectively, at the narrow channels and reef-strewn waters where speed and maneuverability might matter more than armor and firepower. In 1938, the Navy held competitions for small, fast attack boats. Several companies submitted designs, Elco, Higgins, and Huckins among others. The specifications were demanding, 60 to 80 feet in length, capable of 40 knots or more, able to carry torpedoes and machine guns, shallow draft for operating in coastal waters, and most challenging of all, capable of being produced quickly and in large numbers if war came. The designs that emerged were engineering compromises, trading armor for speed, trading seaworthiness for shallow draft, trading crew comfort for weapons capacity. PT boats were never meant to be capital ships or fleet units. They were meant to be expendable weapons, cheap enough to lose, fast enough to escape, deadly enough to justify their existence. The hulls were constructed primarily of plywood. 2 layers of mahogany planking with aircraft fabric between them glued and screwed together. This sounds insane, building combat vessels from wood in an era of steel warships, but plywood had advantages. It was light, which meant speed. It was easy to repair with materials available anywhere. It was non-magnetic, which meant Japanese magnetic mines were useless against us. And when you're building hundreds of boats quickly, plywood and wood construction meant that you could use boat yards and furniture factories, mobilizing industries that couldn't build steel ships. But plywood also meant that any hit from any weapon would penetrate. We had no armor except for some steel plating around the cockpit and guns. A single 5-inch shell from a destroyer could punch through one side of our boat and out the other. A near miss from a bomb could stove in our hull like cardboard. We joked darkly that our boat's armor was spiritual. It worked if you believed in it hard enough. The engines were Packard V-12s, liquid-cooled monsters derived from aircraft engines. Each engine generated 1,500 horsepower, and PT boats carried 3 of them, giving us 4,500 total horsepower, driving 3 propellers through reduction gears. This was an insane amount of power for an 80-foot boat. To put it in perspective, a modern destroyer of the same era might have 50,000 horsepower, but displace 2,000 tons. We displaced 50 tons fully loaded and had nearly 10% of a destroyer's power. The power-to-weight ratio meant that under ideal conditions, we could hit 43, maybe 45 knots. In reality, with combat loads, rough seas, and engines that were never quite at 100%, we were lucky to sustain 35 knots. But that was still faster than any Japanese destroyer could manage, and speed was our primary defense. The problem with these beautiful, powerful engines was that they were temperamental as hell. They were designed for aircraft, meant to run at high altitudes where air was cool and dry. We were running them at sea level, in tropical humidity, in an environment of salt spray and coral dust, often at full throttle for hours at a time. They overheated constantly. Spark plugs fouled. Cooling systems leaked. The reduction gears, which stepped down the high RPMs of the engines to appropriate propeller speeds, wore quickly and sometimes failed catastrophically, shredding gears and leaving you with 1 or 2 engines when you desperately needed all 3.
Every motor machinist's mate in the PT boat force was part mechanic, part magician. We kept these engines running through constant maintenance, field repairs, and occasional prayers. We'd rebuild engines on active patrol, swapping parts between engines to keep at least 2 running. We'd run them with misfiring cylinders, with coolant leaks that left a white trail in the water behind us, with oil consumption so high we were adding quarts every hour. The Packards were mechanical marvels that should have been impossible to maintain in combat conditions. Yet, somehow, most of the time, they got us home. Armament evolved rapidly as we learned what worked. The early PT boats carried 2 or 4 torpedoes, Mark 8s, that were essentially smaller versions of submarine torpedoes. These were 21-inch diameter, 2,000 pounds of weapon, including a 466-pound TNT warhead. They were set to run at a specified depth and speed, gyroscopes keeping them on a straight course after launch. In theory. In practice, Mark 8 torpedoes were notorious for mechanical failures. They'd run too deep, passing under targets. They'd porpoise, jumping in and out of the water. The magnetic detonators often failed. The contact detonators weren't much better. We'd watch torpedoes hit Japanese ships squarely and fail to explode, the weapons bouncing off enemy hulls like defective fireworks. The torpedo problem plagued American submarines as well, and it took until 1943 for the Navy to finally admit the Mark 8 and its submarine counterparts were fatally flawed. Fixes were implemented, better detonators developed, depth keeping improved, but in the Solomon Islands in mid-1943, we were still firing torpedoes that had maybe a 60% chance of working as designed.
This meant getting very close, firing multiple torpedoes, and hoping probability favored us. The guns were more reliable. Early PT boats had minimal armament, maybe 2.5 caliber machine guns, but combat experience taught us that we needed more firepower, both for attacking small targets like barges and for defense when Japanese ships lit us up with searchlights. By the time I arrived in the Solomons, PT boats were floating gun platforms. Twin .5 caliber guns in a powered turret forward, 2 more .5s on a manual mount aft, a 20mm Oerlikon cannon amidships. Some boats added 37mm or 40mm guns. A few experimental boats mounted rockets or extra machine guns until they were so heavy and top-heavy that their performance suffered. The .5 caliber Browning machine gun was America's gift to infantry and vehicle warfare, a reliable, hard-hitting weapon that fired half-inch diameter bullets at 2,900 feet per second. In the aircraft version, they were legendary, but in the naval adaptation, firing from a moving platform at moving targets in darkness, their effectiveness depended heavily on the skill of the gunner and the fragility of the target. Against aircraft, they were marginal. You had to hit a plane multiple times to bring it down. Against barges and small craft, they were devastating. Against destroyers, they were psychological weapons, forcing Japanese crews to take cover, disrupting fire control, buying seconds for us to escape. The Oerlikon was theoretically more potent, firing explosive shells instead of solid bullets. But the Oerlikon had a fatal flaw in the humid Pacific. It jammed constantly. Salt spray corroded the delicate feed mechanism, humidity swelled the wooden shell spacers in the ammunition drums. In combat, you might get 40 or 50 rounds before the jam, and clearing it under fire, with shells exploding around you and the boat maneuvering violently, was a nightmare. Our Oerlikon gunner, a kid named Richards, had developed a semi-mystical relationship with his weapon, performing rituals to keep it running, cleaning it compulsively, rotating ammunition drums to prevent moisture buildup, even talking to it like a temperamental pet. The radar was primitive but revolutionary. A small air search set mounted on a mast, it could detect large ships at maybe 10 miles in good conditions, closer in rain or rough seas. The display was a fuzzy green screen with blips that might be ships, islands, rain squalls, or ghosts in the system. Interpreting radar returns was more art than science, and Kowalski, our radar operator, had developed an uncanny ability to tell Japanese ships from spurious contacts. He said he could recognize the characteristic return of a destroyer versus a cruiser, though he suspected I was also using intuition and prayer. The radio was a standard Navy set, powerful enough to reach our base at Rendova or communicate with other PT boats in our division. Radio discipline was critical. Every transmission was a beacon telling the Japanese where we were. We maintained radio silence on patrol, listening but not transmitting unless absolutely necessary. If we engaged and survived, we'd break silence to report contact, position, and results, but by then the Japanese knew exactly where we were anyway because we just shot torpedoes at them. Navigation equipment was basic: magnetic compass, gyroscope, charts, and the quartermaster's knowledge of these waters. No GPS, no satellite navigation, no electronic aids beyond dead reckoning and visual references. At night, in unfamiliar waters, navigation was educated guesswork. We'd identify islands by their silhouettes against the stars, navigate by the glow of volcanic peaks, use our depth sounder to find reefs and channels. Getting lost was easy. Running aground in darkness was a constant fear, and several PT boats had been lost that way, stuck on reefs when dawn came, bombed and strafed into wreckage before they could refloat. PT boats earned their mosquito boat nickname honestly. Like mosquitoes, we were small, annoying, and individually inconsequential, but in numbers, we could drive much larger creatures to distraction. A single PT boat was a minor nuisance to a Japanese destroyer, but 4 or 6 PT boats attacking from multiple directions in darkness, forcing the destroyer to maneuver wildly, dividing its fire control, creating chaos, that could be decisive. Or fatal to us if the destroyer's crew was experienced and their guns accurate. The Japanese had learned to respect us, or at least to take us seriously. Early in the Guadalcanal campaign, they dismissed PT boats as minor threats, barely worth expending ammunition on, but we'd sunk enough of their ships, barges mindly, but even a few destroyers and cruisers, that by mid-1943, they'd developed tactics specifically for dealing with us. Their destroyers now carried smaller caliber weapons, machine guns and light cannon, specifically for anti-PT boat defense. They used searchlights more aggressively, knowing that once they illuminated us, their advantage in firepower would end the engagement quickly. They'd learned to zigzag, making torpedo targeting harder. They'd learned to charge,